As I say here, there are copies now. Some of those copies you can see if you go to Turkey. You can see a copy of the Quran. And I saw that also. I saw the one also in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. If you go to Uzbekistan, quite interesting to see that it's almost this big, how big that copy of Uthman is. I saw it. I have pictures of it. I looked for it last night, could not find those pictures of that copy of Uthman in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. So we do have that copy of Uthman Quran, the first one, in a paper sort of book, and in a deer skin. There are two of them. You see the one in Turkey as well. As you can tell here, 7 of those copies were sent out to 7 different areas within the Muslim empire, if you will, and people were given the sort of the go forward to writing it after that, to copying it, but with conditions. So every city, every state made its own committee to ensure that no one writes on his own without final approval of it. I'll move forward now as we get deeper into the issues of human rights and women and gender and themes and problems of dealing with the Quran. The contents of these narratives, the content of these narratives in the Quran are the stories of the prophets of Allah, of God, their peoples, their messages, their call, their persecution. The Quran speaks about what happened to Moses with Egypt and the whole narrative of the Exodus in details, in absolute details. Stories about the past events and things that may happen in the future. References to events that took place during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. There is a lot of focus in the Quran on the story of Adam, Moses, Joseph, Jesus, and Muhammad. Specific facts for you guys. Muhammad by name is mentioned in the Quran 5 times. Jesus Christ is mentioned in the Quran by name and title 168 times. There's much more about Jesus in the Quran than there is about Muhammad, by the way. Muslims might be surprised here, as well as Christians. There's more about Moses in the Quran than there's about Muhammad, as I said earlier, a way for Muslims to learn from the experience of their earlier prophets, Moses and Jesus, but also because for Islam, Moses and Jesus are not seen as outsiders. For Islam, Jesus is not out there and Moses out there and I'm here. Jesus is a part of my Muslim story. Moses is a part of my Muslim story. Abraham is a part of my Muslim story. So
where is Abraham?
I'm sorry, falling out from the me, 3:30 a.m. timing. But thank you. The story is there. The story is there. And the story of Abraham is the story of Islam too. Every time Muhammad spoke about Jesus and Moses, he used the reference, Akhi, my brother Jesus, my brother Moses. He never spoke of Jesus, just Jesus, plain Jesus. He always said, Akhi, my brother Jesus, my brother Moses. The only story in the Quran of a prophet that comes all in one chapter, the only is the story of Joseph, Yusuf. Comes all in one chapter. So there are a lot of stories. Some people, some Muslims would say, well, there are some references to science in the Quran. Some Muslims would say, well, I'm not going to buy even this argument. I don't care whether there is or there are no references to science in the Quran. Say this is a book of spirituality. It does not need to include science to believe in God or in the book. But some Muslims make these references, that there are some references to science in the Quran. The earth was previously part of the sun in chapter 21, verse 30. The oxygen content of the air is reduced in higher altitudes in chapter 6, verse 125. The embryo in the womb is enclosed by 3 coverings, chapter 39, verse 6. The fertilization of certain plants is done by the wind, 1522. Each human being has a permanent individual fingerprint in chapter 75, verse 4. So some Muslims refer to these verses and say, you see, if this was the making of Muhammad, how would have Muhammad known that every human being has his or her own fingerprint? It is God making the book. And God only at that time knew that every human being had his own fingerprint. Now, main objectives of the Quran. Main objectives. Do we need to take a break? No? Yes? No? Yes?
No, Imam, not until 12:30. We'll take a lunch break.
Okay. What I'm trying to do now as I walk with you, what I have told you so far in the last hour, is really an appetizer trying to introduce you to how this book came about. What I will do from now on is talking about the objectives of the Quran. What does the Quran want Muslims to achieve? The paradigm, the teachings, but also the problems of how Muslims have dealt with this text. So we'll get deeper into those issues. Before I move forward, any question about the history and how everything came about so far? Any question? Yes, sir.
Imam, you said that the causes of revelation are critical to understand.
Yes.
And also the fact there were Makkah surahs and Medina surahs and the reasons you gave. Does that mean that we need to look at many of these things just contextually and therefore it was fine at that time, but little or no relevance to us at this time?
Absolutely not. What I'm saying is the context helps you understand what the Quran is trying to do. What do I mean by that? In the study of jurisprudence, fiqh or sharia, there's something called maqasid al-sharia. It's a book that I want you guys to look at and read if you can, called Towards Realization of the Higher Intents of Islamic Law. Very important point. Every time the Quran tells you do or don't because of something called illah, reason. The Quran does not just want you to give up on drinking because the Quran is interested in torturing you. There's a reason of why the Quran does not want you to drink. Okay? There's a reason of why the Quran wants you to do what the Quran wants you to do, and why the Quran does not want you to do something. Okay? When you study the social, political, religious context of the verse and the cause of revelation, is to understand what is the illah, what is the reason as to why the verse said what the verse said. Nothing is without a reason. And I say to Muslims all the time, if it does not make sense, it is not Islam. And if it does not have a verse, a hadith, a illah and reason, and if it does not meet the demands of most human beings' intellectual capacity, something's wrong. So, you read that verse, that I'll talk about in details later, after lunch. The Quran says, and if you have a problem with your spouse, then you do 1, 2, 3, and idribuhun. Some people translate that ayah to mean beat your wives up, according to the translation you have. So the Quran is saying to men, go and beat up your wives? When you go and study the context of the verse, it has nothing to do with beating. How do you understand that? Because of the context, because of the language, and because of the illah. The Quran, in none of its ilal reasons, has that beating as a cause or a way by which you can fix your spouse. A man, a woman, a woman, a man. So the ayah means something else. The word means something other than beating. You see where the problem comes in from? That's what I'm talking about. So how can
interpretation?
We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in details how it came about. to satisfy your question, but we'll talk about the details. The word idribuhun in Arabic has 37 meanings. We spoke about earlier in the day when we started. One of the meanings is beat. But 7 out of those 37 meanings mean separate. Separate from your spouse. And it makes sense that the Quran says if you're not happy with your spouse, you separate. See?
Said it also makes sense beat. I mean, just.
It makes sense to beat.
I'm not saying I agree with that. I'm just saying, like, how do you know one is wrong and the other?
We'll talk about it in detail.
Oh,
Believe me, we will.
Why would you pick the one? If it's only one meaning is to beat, why would you pick that one out of 37
We'll talk about it later, trust me. Remember that we had patriarchal male-dominant societies. And in those male-dominant societies, men wanted us to believe that the only way to fix, I'm not using their terms, your wife is to beat her up, to show that you're in control. And men could do that, and no one could say no. Male-dominant societies, especially the tribal society. That's where you pick up that meaning. Now, how do we do whether it means this or that? That's what I will talk about later. When you study the context, you discover that it has nothing to do with beating. When you talk about other verses of the Quran, you discover that it has nothing to do with beating. And when we ask the Prophet to give us a solution, we also discover it has nothing to do with beating. So where did that come from? Someone decided at one point in the history of Islam that let's take that specific meaning. Without consulting the rest of the Quran, the rest of the Prophet's story of how he himself treated his wife Khadija for 25 years of marriage before she died, or almost celibate before she died, or you see where I'm coming from? So without consulting any of this data, people decide this must be the meaning, because it makes sense to that specific man in that specific environment. Do I say, if you're on my Facebook, you might have seen the message, I know Angela did. I got a message a few days ago about we in the 21st century need to re-examine and revisit our own understanding of the Quranic language and how we interpreted it to mean exactly other things that we have not for so many years understood. See where I'm coming from? We'll talk about it more in details. Be patient with me. I promise you, many of the questions will be answered. But does that answer your question somehow?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So sort of we study the codes to understand the context and how that context was understood in light of that specific reality. So the main objectives of the Quran, it was obviously revealed to Muslims to give these main 5 objectives. Number 1, new paradigms on faith and the creed through Tawheed. Islam wanted to tell Muslims of how they can understand faith and creed in the right way according to Muslims. Basically, Tawheed, maintaining the oneness of God, that there's only one God in this universe. This is the main objective of the Quran. You see that from chapter 1 to chapter 114. How can Muslims come to the realization there's one God for this universe? Number 2, within that paradigm, talking about offering a new concept of prophecy and prophethood. For example, Islam came and offered us a new story about the prophets, such as that the prophets are sinless. They don't lie, they don't commit adultery, they don't steal, they don't murder. So the Prophet offered a new story about prophets. So how would the Quran deal with the story of Moses, who is offered in the Bible as having killed the Egyptian? You see, Moses was a prophet, and the prophet is sinless. What is going on here? Obviously, the Quran is wrong. The Quran would never say that Moses killed the Egyptian. The Quran would say, وَكَزَهُ. pushed him away. So, any lawyers here? Any lawyers? One lawyer, no. That's great. You know, first degree murder, second degree murder, intent and motivation, you do that. So according to the Quranic narrative of the story of Moses and the Egyptian, he only intended to push the guy aside, to separate between him and the Israelite. He did not mean to kill him. He only meant to bring a fight to an end with a good motivation. Moses will never kill, will never murder. So what happened? The man died. So the scholars of tafsir of exegesis said, I'll tell you the story. Now this is their interpretation, my language. Obviously the Egyptian had brief history of 10 heart attacks, 3 bypasses, and Moses, you have this strong, willed, fit guy. When he pushed the guy away, for what example, it was too hard of a push. Ended up killing him, that's true, but he did not intend to kill him. So this is how we come to the defense of Moses in that story. To say that prophets continue to be sinless, they make mistakes. Obviously he miscalculated his push, but you would never consider it a murder with the goal of killing. See where I'm coming from? So that portion of the story would not be in the Quran. This is how the Quran offers a new reconstructing